to be joined by Sammy Arthur from California Audubon, Sandy Matsumoto from the Nature Conservancy, and Debbie Orris from Community Water Center. Their bios are in your participant packet if you'd like to review those. I'm not going to read them aloud to you today. Sammy, let's start with you. Please tell us about the Groundwater Leadership Forum GSP review and your reflections from that review process. And just so you're aware, Atlee can give you, as speakers, control so that you can advance the slides on your own.
And you should have access now.
Hold on, wait for it. Oh, did I do that or did you do that?
You did that.
Okay, great. Okay, sounds good. All right, well, thanks so much, Danielle, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you guys for coordinating and putting this together. It's a huge level of work, and I know a special challenge when we're not in person. Yeah, I'm excited to be able to kind of start us off talking about 2020 plan lesson learned, plan review lessons learned. I'm going to go into what we did as a Groundwater Leadership Forum in our review of draft GSPs and how we're moving forward in reviewing final GSPs to kind of lay the groundwork here to have a conversation about lessons learned. So let's see if I can do this. All right. So first, the group that I'm going to be representing and talking about is the Groundwater Leadership Forum, and this has been funded by the Water Foundation. And so all of our work that we've done in GSP review has really been supported by the Water Foundation and really enabled by their support, so that we can work with consultants and actually bring in extra capacity to be able to do this level of GSP review. So I point that out because it is one of the lessons learned is that this is has been very time intensive and very demanding to cover a lot of GSPs. But I think that there's lessons for folks who are focused on specific basins that won't require as much kind of capacity and time. So the Groundwater Leadership Forum is a collaborative of environmental justice NGOs, natural resource NGOs, and academic institutions. And we've had sort of a kind of a smaller group that has led the GSP review, both of public drafts and in the critically overdraft basins, and then moving into final ones. So the first thing we did in our process to come up with how we wanted to review GSPs is we had to, within our collaborative, decide what were our interests. So what were kind of the key things that we cared about in Sigma, and I think, you know, reflected in some of people's chats, what were the things that maybe would find in our absence without the participation of the folks on this call. And so what we came up with was climate, groundwater dependent ecosystems, interconnected surface waters, drinking water, and stakeholder engagement. And I should point out that we did have a pretty robust discussion about wanting to confirm that GSPs were communicating with each other across, both within basins and across basin lines, because they're so fragmented and we're not frequently seeing one GSP for one basin. That was something that we prioritized, or that we thought was a high priority, but we were not able to focus on in our review. So I want to point that out as kind of a lesson or things for people to be thinking about in their review of groundwater plans. So then next we went through a process of prioritizing, okay, which GSPs are we going to review? And again, you know, this is kind of a reflection of what those key beneficial users and also, you know, what our key interests were. But also we thought more about, okay, where are other organizations covering already? Where can we complement folks who are working in certain basins and may need extra capacity? So we added that kind of overlay to figure out which GSPs we wanted to review. And we also wanted to make sure that we looked at one GSP per critically overdrafted basin. So with our budget and our time, we were able to come up with a list of about 30 GSPs that we reviewed. And that was in the draft GSP phase, and right now we're doing that same list of 30 and reviewing the final GSPs that were submitted to DWR. So we're basically looking at our drinking water systems, GDEs, disadvantaged communities. It's been a real process for us, I think, to go through, okay, these are our key interests. These are the core things that we want to see represented in GSPs, and where in the regulations, where in the statute are the levers, where are the important places that we know these are required to be represented. So I think we really went through a process of kind of first being really in the weeds and really detailed, and we came up with these indicators that matched our interests according to the GSP outline that DWR defined. So we have specific questions under each of these indicators that are pretty detailed, like, do the maps represent GDEs? Do the maps represent disadvantaged communities? And what data are they using for disadvantaged communities, census block, et cetera? So we came up with a large review form. We called it our indicator form, and it's basically like a 14, 15-page form that goes through each of those indicators, and we ask ourselves a main question. So this is kind of the most simple one: identification of beneficial users. Were key beneficial users identified and engaged? And then we have this whole series of detailed questions. And we applied this to all of the draft GSPs, the 30 that we reviewed. And again, this is with consultant support who went through and actually read the documents and answered these questions for us. So we started really detailed, and I think I want to point this out as one of the lessons. And as we gathered all of this information from the 30 GSPs, we really had to challenge ourselves to step back and say, okay, like, what are the big issues and the big takeaways that we're seeing here? And those fell into three categories. And this might be something that folks could think about, take as a lesson and think about in the 2022 plans, or think about in review of the final GSPs kind of from the beginning, because this is what we found going through the process of really starting in the weeds and then pulling back. And we found kind of three main areas of deficiencies in the draft GSPs. And the first one is a big one and kind of lays the foundation for everything, and is probably the cause of the other deficiencies. That's a lack of engagement. So both the environmental and the disadvantaged community beneficial users frequently not being either identified in plans or not being appropriately engaged, not having a stakeholder plan in the GSP, or not having folks involved in boards or advisory committees. That's a real deficiency that we saw, and a pattern we saw across these draft GSPs. And then I'll just point out that in the regulations for DWR, one of the requirements is a responsiveness of GSAs to comments that raise credible technical or policy issues with the plan. So it really is a requirement that stakeholders are engaged, and that's something we're applying to the review of the final GSPs to see if folks were responsive to our comments and others' comments. The other kind of main area where we saw deficiencies was kind of like a lack of analysis of the impacts of the GSP. So a lot of the GSPs were not looking at how drinking water wells for small drinking water systems and disadvantaged communities would be impacted by their plan, and more specifically by the continuing drop in groundwater levels from their plan. We're also not seeing a lot of analysis of how groundwater dependent ecosystems are impacted, and our two other panelists, Sandy and Debbie, will talk about these two topics in more detail. And we're also seeing folks not including the required water sectors in water budgets. That was a pattern where native vegetation and managed wetlands where they exist are not included in the water budgets. And then another big one that's pretty foundational is we saw a pattern of not adequately including climate change in water projections. Most folks did follow the DWR guidance for climate change to a certain extent, but there were deficiencies in using climate change in future projections, which of course, is problematic for actually having a functional plan. And then the sort of final category of deficiency that we saw was the outcomes of the plan, lacking in terms of what the projects and management actions are, and how folks are coming up with timelines and schedules, or not coming up with timelines and schedules and funding sources And of course, that is not really charting a path to sustainability and leading the plan, not leading the basin to the outcome that Sigma is really all about. So when we went through our process of review, we started really detailed. We kind of came back to these are the three key things that we saw in the review of 30 GSPs, and I think we learned this from going through the process, but hopefully that's helpful for people who are now applying this going forward. And so we're taking that and integrating it into our review of the final groundwater sustainability plans, which is what we're conducting now. And in this process, because stakeholder engagement is a big piece, we really want to see if they're responding to our comments. So that's part of the analysis. And we have some top level things that we're looking for. Do they include the stakeholder engagement plan? Do they identify disadvantaged communities? These are key, very basic, very baseline things that we think should result in a failing GSP if they're not in place. And then we've come up with a pretty targeted list of, okay, what are 180-day fixes that folks should be required to put in place to remedy deficiencies in their plans that are mostly available at their fingertips, and they need to be integrated into the plan with DWR actually, requiring that. So that's kind of how we're thinking about the review of the final GSPs, which again, we're in process right now, so we can answer questions about that as we go into the final, the panel piece. So I'll pass on to Sandy.
Great, thanks, Sammy. Hi, everyone. I don't have any slides, but I'm just going to kind of cover the review that focus more on the kind of natural resources end of the GSP components. And just to clarify, so the Nature Conservancy worked on our own review, which was pretty in-depth. And for those who are familiar with our website, we have a checklist of things that we were looking for how groundwater dependent ecosystems are incorporated into the plan. It follows the outline and the requirements under Sigma. And we took the analysis that we did, and then we fed it into the Groundwater Leadership Forum process. So Sammy mentioned that groundwater dependent ecosystems were incorporated into the collaborative forum review. Basically, in most cases, what happened was we did the TNC review first and then handed it over to the leadership forum and integrated them so that they were consistent. So I'm going to talk more about the TNC in-depth review, but obviously has implications for how the leadership forum ended up where we did on the on our comments. So the Nature Conservancy reviewed roughly 30 plans also. And, prior to reviewing the plans, we had put out a number of tools to help people firstly know what groundwater dependent ecosystems are. So those plants and animals that depend on groundwater to meet at least a portion of their water needs. We put out a guidance on how to incorporate GDEs into the plan. We, with Department of Water Resources, published a map that is should be the starting point for most folks who are mapping groundwater dependent ecosystems. And it's hosted on the DWR website, and it's also known as the natural communities commonly associated with groundwater data sets. So marketing genius there. So the NC data set is out there. All the GSAs have access to it. It is free. And we found actually that most, but not all, of the GSAs use this as the basis for their GDE mapping. So mapping of groundwater dependent ecosystems is required under the law. And, I think getting back to kind of what Sammy was saying, if that first step was missed, it's similar to, it's like identifying one of the beneficial users. If that first step was missed, or if they were eliminated early on in the process, that falls through the whole plan, because then that means they weren't included in the sustainability goal. There weren't thresholds. Thresholds didn't consider them. They weren't considered in the monitoring plan or the management action. So that early step was a way of basically excluding things in the entirety of the plan, which was one of the big problems that we saw. For those who are interested in what the letters said, They're available on our Groundwater Resource Hub website. And then we also posted all of our letters, TNC and the Groundwater Leadership Forum, to the Sigma portal. So they're available up there as well, and that's a helpful resource for folks who want to see what other letters came in or how people were commenting. And we posted those to the initial GSP notification page on the Sigma portal, so you can go there and take a look at those. So what we found through our process was, you know, the headline takeaway is, you know, not surprisingly, there were a good amount of groundwater dependent ecosystems that were excluded. So most started with our map, some didn't, but they basically took the map and said, for a number of reasons, we're going to cut these ecosystems out. Couple of the common reasons for why GDEs were cut out of the plans. One was the presence of surface water. So if it, you know, if it was like within 100 yards of a stream, or there was irrigation nearby, or some surface water input, they use that as a reason to say that it's not groundwater dependent, which is not true. It can be true. They could be surface water dependent, but that in and of itself is not a scientifically based rationale for eliminating GDEs wholesale. So a lot of what you're seeing is just erring on the side of, no, we don't need to do it, and then cutting them out and moving on. A second reason that we saw that was pretty common, that was problematic, was that they were looking at groundwater levels and basically interpolating, using groundwater monitoring wells that were really far away from the GDEs. And so while depth far away from the GDEs might be really low, groundwater levels might be really low, we're finding that actually a lot of the GDEs are in places where there happen to be really shallow or perched aquifers, and they're missing that because they're taking groundwater data from too far away from and they have no way of even monitoring what shallow groundwater levels look like. So these kind of broad brush, you know, looking at the wrong types of data for the analyses, and not erring on the side of conservatism, which would just be to include them as potentially groundwater dependent. I think what we're seeing is more they're erring on the side of that, we can't prove that they are absolutely groundwater dependent, so we're going to just get rid of them altogether. As far as what we learned, I would echo what Sammy said. The review process is extraordinarily resource intensive, and it, even just if you're looking at one basin, that's hard enough, because it's in a lot of basins it was unclear when the drafts were coming out, how long the comment period was, even for what level the plan was being developed at, because some plans are individual plans, some plans are nested within other plans and they share like an executive summary. There's all these different weird combinations of how the plans came together, and even just tracking that stuff was a job. And as a consequence, it was resource intensive, but it also makes coordinating comments really difficult, especially for those of us who are doing it kind of from a centralized view and trying to do a whole bunch of them. The timeline is such that we're barely getting these comments in. And I think in most cases we would love to get broader coalition letters, or we would love to have more coordination of comments, but the timeframes are just not allowing for that. And that was something that I found really challenging and hard, because I think it's sort of against what we normally like to do as a practice. I found, at least from the Nature Conservancy's perspective, is as we were doing the comments, we got so detailed because we wanted to see everything, and I think the Mad Libs this morning there's an inherent mismatch, right, between our aspirations for what Sigma should be doing and what actually is being implemented. And when we made our checklist, and at least when TNC made our checklist, we were like, this is what it's all, if they fully implement the law, all the provisions for nature, these are all the things they should be doing. And actually, if they're doing like the first two steps, this first round of plans, that would be huge. But because we were trying to make sure that it was comprehensive, I think I often say we lost the forest for the trees, because we were so focused on trying to get everything that our comments we realized partway through our process that they were so detailed, it was hard to even tell what we were trying to say, or like if they fixed one thing, what would the one thing be that we wanted them to fix? So we're trying to take that step back and address this issue as we go into comments on the final GSPs. And then I think, just thinking ahead to 2022, you'll hear from Ruthie Redmond this afternoon. We're trying to provide more transparency into these comments. And we have a tool that we're going to be working on and would love input on, but I'll leave that as a teaser for this afternoon's tool session. The other thing I think that's being lost in all of this is the roll-up of the statewide impacts of what's going on, and hopefully Debbie will touch on this as well. But TNC is trying to take what everyone's doing at the local level and roll it up to be able to say something like, okay, through this process, X% of GDEs were eliminated, just so we have that, overall picture of what's going on at the state level, because I think it's death by a million cuts. Like all these little decisions that are being made at the local scale. It's like, oh, we don't have to do that. We're not doing that. But then if everyone does it, we're ended up with nothing. And that being able to portray that state level piece is really important. So I think there's a couple of things too that we could think about from a policy perspective to advocate for going forward. I have two very specific things that I'd like to put forth. One is, it would be really great if, so these plans are multidisciplinary inherently, right? Like to do our review, we have a hydrogeologist, we have ecologists, we have geospatial specialists, like we have all of these technical experts who are helping inform our comments. It would be great if DWR would bring in a panel of advisors who had those sets of expertise, so that if they brought in sister agencies like Department of Fish and Wildlife, for example, to help comment from the inside as opposed to having to submit comment letters, that would be a better process for 2022. The second piece, my second recommendation is super nitpicky, but I just want to get it out there. DWR had the authority, but chose not to exercise it to request shapefiles for the data in their maps. And so because we don't have the shapefile data we're going out to the individual GSAs and asking them, can you give us the files of how you created your map so we have the data of how you mapped your GDEs so that we can aggregate, put Humpty Dumpty back together again and see what it looks like from a statewide perspective. But because DWR decided not to exercise that authority, we have to do that on the individual GSA by GSA basis, and obviously not all of them are going to cooperate. So that's just another thing where it's putting more, the onus on us to do yet more work when they could have made a very simple request. Those files exist. They had to make those files in order to make their maps in the first place. Just collect the data. So I think we should think a little bit about what other data collection we want to be getting with the 2022 plans. We've already talked to them about the 2020 plans. They're not going to go and ask for this stuff now, but there's an opportunity for 2022 as we think forward. So I'll leave it there and we can move over to Debbie.
Thanks, Sandy.
That was terrific.
Hi, everyone. My name's Debbie. I'm with the Community Water Center. And for anybody who doesn't know us, we're a nonprofit based in Visalia, but we have offices in Sacramento and Watsonville, and we focus on working with disadvantaged communities throughout the South San Joaquin Valley and the Salinas Valley, and kind of continuing to grow throughout the Central Coast. So in our plan review, at least in the draft, we focused on 6 plans, 5 within the Centrality, 1 on the coast. In the Centrality, we did Kings River East, Eastern Tule, East Cahuilla, Lower Tule, Pixley, and then on the coast, we did Salinas within the 180/400-foot basin. And our focus was on impacts of drinking water users and stakeholder engagement. Kind of across the board, these plans had some pretty common deficiencies in regards to these 2 important focuses. We saw, failure to consider water quality, despite the fact that water quality is one of the 6 undesirable results of SGMA. A lot of GSAs are choosing to ignore that undesirable result, saying that it's, say nitrates is within the realm of the Irrigated Lands Program or other nitrate regulatory programs. and saying, well, naturally occurring contaminants, that's not our issue. But there's a lot that management actions can do to increase or decrease the concentration of these contaminants. So they really need to be focusing on that. They're also failing to consider, in general, the impacts of the plan upon shallow domestic wells. They failed to adequately engage all stakeholders. Some GSAs did slightly better than others, but generally meetings were held in the middle of the day on a weekday when people who have to work and their job is not to go to these meetings can't attend. Childcare wasn't offered, and translation was largely non-existent, both for meetings and for materials. All the GSPs we reviewed, their minimum thresholds and measurable objectives were wholly inadequate. Several set their minimum thresholds that, as a reminder, those are the worst that they're going to allow their basin to get. Originally, they set those at what if sigma didn't exist? What would conditions look like? You don't get a gold star for doing slightly better than if sigma doesn't exist. So after a lot of pushback, the GSAs changed the minimum thresholds to maybe 10 or 20% better than if sigma didn't exist. Still wholly inadequate. And we've done recently an analysis showing that 40 to 80% in many basins, shallow domestic wells will go dry at the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. Generally, there's a lack of political will to require adequate pumping restrictions. And when they do come up with kind of pumping restrictions through the use of allocations, they're not considering the needs. Many GSPs are not considering the needs of drinking water users and small community water systems. If a small disadvantaged community needs more allocation, more pumping credits, they're not going to be able to, if there's a groundwater market, they're not going to be able to compete for pumping credits against, say, Westlands. It's really not reasonable to assume that. Another pretty common deficiency was how undesirable results were defined. Many of the undesirable results in the plans that we looked at were defined as impacting 50% plus one of the wells within the GSA's boundaries. For pretty much all undesirable results, the ones that are going to kind of comprise most, if not all, of that 50% plus one are shallow domestic wells that are serving disadvantaged communities. So by defining undesirable results in this way, you're ensuring that communities who have the least amount of resources to be able to address these impacts are going to be the ones who feel these impacts most acutely. It's also ignoring two of the beneficial users that are called out within SGMA, domestic well users and disadvantaged communities. And even within that, we were pushing for a lot of GSAs to incorporate a drinking water mitigation plan, which would consider how to prevent impacts to drinking water users, as well as if negative impacts do occur, what do you do to mitigate those impacts? So as emergency measures, if wells go dry or contaminant plumes move, getting emergency water to them, and maybe long-term is facilitating consolidations. I will note that Kings River East did a slightly better job with stakeholder engagement than the other GSAs that we worked with. They do have a seat for drinking water users on their board, and they did do some outreach. They still had meetings in the middle of the day, though, which doesn't facilitate communities to really be able to participate. In terms of plan review, I echo a lot of what Sandy said. It was really resource intensive. We were lucky to have a grant from DWR to work on SGMA. And so that was able to fund our review of all Central Valley plans. We were able to hire consultants to do the review because we don't have that technical expertise in-house. And that was so critical. That took up we were able to use that review to write our letters, but still, even writing the letters took a lot of staff time to be able to do. And having the GLF was able to do a more in-depth review of silliness, and that was how we were able to comment on the silliness plan. But it's without the resources to hire consultants, it would be very difficult for us to be able to comment on plans. And so we're thinking about that for 2022 plans on the Central Coast. The other thing that we weren't able to do due to lack of kind of time and resources is look at the coordination agreements. That was brought up earlier about how there's a lot of interconnection between the different GSPs within one basin, and we're not able to look at those. We weren't able to, and we're not going to be able to look at those for final plan review. In terms of what tools could be useful for GSAs to improve their plans, and what they could do to improve their plans is really they have to consider impacts to drinking water users, whether that is domestic well communities, state smalls, or small public water systems. They have to consider the impacts of both groundwater levels and groundwater quality. Groundwater quality is something that GSAs need to be looking at. We are aware that the data on groundwater quality is lacking compared to a lot of the quantity data, but there is tools that are coming out or that have come out recently that can really help. Gamma released their water quality tool a few months ago. CWC has released our drinking water tool, which I'll be talking about during the tools fair. Soon, Water Foundation will be releasing a white paper that EPI did on the impacts of two wells within the Central Valley at the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. CWC helped kind of guide that, and that report will look at, where the impacts are, how many people will be impacted, what the costs associated with those impacts look like. And then I know DWR is working on a drought tool, and CWC is working on legislation to require drought contingency plans so we can have a better idea of how drought will impact small communities. But in general, we're really hoping that DWR sends back quite a number of these plans, at least for the 180-day cure period. The GSAs can then use a lot of these new tools that have come out or will have come out by that point to improve their plans, improve minimum thresholds, improve measurable objectives. And generally, when DWR is doing this review, I echo what Sandy said, they really need to be relying on their sister agencies and not just kind of asking for their advice and then ignoring them, which has happened before, but really incorporating, if State Water Board goes, this is wholly inadequate, DWR needs to listen to that and put that into their final assessment. So, we're hopeful that eventually these plans will be fixed, but we'll have to see. So I'll wrap there.
Thanks so much, Debbie, Sandy, and Sammy. It was really great. We have a number of questions that have come in from our participants. First, I'd love to start off with the biggest elephant in the room that we've discussed on the collaborative is that stakeholder engagement across the board is inadequate. And especially given the current shelter-in-place directive is likely to continue for the next several months, what recommendations should we make either to GSAs or to DWR for improving engagement under these conditions? And all three of you can unmute and take turns responding.
I can jump on that. It's something that CWC has been putting in a lot of thought ever since the COVID outbreak really began. There's a number of GSAs that are still holding in-person meetings, which is really unsafe, really doesn't facilitate community engagement. Remote options are not being made available. But even if they are, there's a question of how do you notice these meetings adequately so the communities understand? And there's also the issue of translation. So really, I mean, you can do remote meetings. you have to be providing translation during these meetings, whether that is a separate call-in number for translation, for a translator, or if it's all on one call. We really think that meetings need to be held bilingually anyways. But to allow, by conducting the meeting generally bilingually, it ensures that community members who want to participate are able to interject at the relevant times rather than being a few minutes behind and not being able to raise their concerns once translation is finally finished. So it is definitely very difficult. It's at this point, you know, outreach is not something that is easy to do right now. GSAs need to be relying on NGOs that exist within their boundaries who may already have contact with community members. CWC has contact information for a lot of the community members we work with. And I know a lot of other CBOs and groups that are just on the ground have those contacts as well.
Thanks, Debbie. Sandy or Sammy, anything to add?
You know, this is Sandy. So I guess I think this also, for me, just emphasizes how important it would be to have stakeholders not just coming to meetings and participating in public forum, but also just like in, you know, as part of the overall governance of the GSA, right? So there are some examples of GSAs out there who either have representation integrated into their board or who have advisory or technical committees that are advising the board. One example, at least from the environmental perspective, is down in Ventura County. They are now requiring that there's an environmental representative if there's going to be an ag representative. And that kind of, to me, this period of time just shows how important that is, because at a minimum, you know, if they're going to have a meeting, they have to include those folks. So having that structural kind of institutionalized assurance that we have representation in those forums, I think that it's even more important in this moment, and it may be an opportunity to push for that kind of integration, you know, in places where, especially where things are not working as well. And you know, I think if the past is showing us what's gone wrong, there needs to be some adjustments, and it may be an opportunity to make some asks of these GSAs to change it up a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good advice. Thanks, Sandy. And this one to all three of you, I think possibly Sammy initiated the conversation. Can either of you, any of the three of you, provide examples of 2020 plans that, quote, got it right, or at least got some of it right in any specific context, whether it's GDEs or stakeholder engagement or monitoring networks? Sammy responded to this in the chat, but if you could speak more to it, to everyone, that would be great.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I think this is a question that I think is an important one, and we've been getting both from folks reviewing plans and also from leadership in DWR and the Natural Resources Agency, where, you know, they want to be able to point to examples of success or examples of doing this well. So in our review of the 30 draft GSPs, we did not find a GSP that did it well comprehensively on all of the interests that we were evaluating. But we did find differences in terms of, you know, one GSP might have been better at stakeholder engagement. Another one did a better job of including GDEs and analyzing GDEs. So in this process of reviewing final GSPs, one thing that we are also doing is trying to put together model examples of the components that we were looking for in a GSP. We're affectionately calling it our Frankenstein plan, but what we'll be doing is pulling, you know, who did it well to be able to point to those. So I can't really rattle off right now, you know, where to point you guys in terms of specific GSPs, but we will have some more thought behind that and something to share. But, you know, I will caution that one thing we're bumping up against is the 30 GSPs that we selected. We zeroed in on those areas because we had concerns, and you know, partially just from the presence, let's say, of GDEs or the presence of disadvantaged communities, but also in some cases because we thought, okay, there might be deficiencies here. So we aren't necessarily looking at all of the GSPs. There's about 20 other ones where we may have missed some stellar examples that we won't be drawing from in our 30. So that's a limitation there, but I think it's still an important exercise. So we'll have some more to share on that. And then, I mean, the other thing, if folks are interested in that answer now, is we filled out those review forms, the indicator review forms for each of the 30 GSPs that we evaluated. So it's a pretty accessible way to go in and see, okay, how did this GSP deal with this issue? How did they look at beneficial users? How did they look at you know, impacts to wells? And so you would be able to piece together, okay, who was doing it better than others there.
Thanks, Sammy. And that's a good clarification about how and why we chose the plans that we did. There's a follow-up question from Felice, specifically any examples, and this to the whole panel, any examples of basins that at least got community engagement right or did a pretty good job with community engagement? Debbie or Sandy, or either of you aware of any?
Not the ones we worked in. No one really provided translation. No, I think all the GSAs we worked in routinely hold meetings in the middle of a workday. Don't provide childcare, don't provide meals, I mean, it's just, there's so many barriers to communities being able to participate. It's, I don't think any of the GSAs we worked in did a good job.
I think we did find, though, Debbie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there were, in the early rounds, DWR did provide funding to, like you mentioned, some of your guys' involvement, provided funding to some of the stakeholders to participate more actively in GSP development. And so there was a pretty clear difference in the areas where folks were funded to participate and where folks weren't. And that was, you know, kind of a reason to argue for that funding being critical and important going forward.
Absolutely. I mean, we were able to, us, Self-Help Leadership Council, we were able to, you know, hold community meetings on GSAs, get community feedback on the GSPs. And so that was better, but it was different, you know, the GSAs responded differently in kind of varying levels of efficacy in terms of what they took from our feedback.
And that's different than what Sandy mentioned about different stakeholders actually being integrated into the governance.
Yeah.
We have a couple hands raised and we have a bunch of questions that came in through the chat. We're not going to have time to get to all of them, but I'd love to start with Spreck. I've unmuted you if you want to ask your question.
Hi. Thanks. You know, I'm all for working cooperatively with water agencies, and I think in many cases we can do a good job. But just at some point, somebody's going to be over the line, and somebody's going to need to get sued. And I wonder if any of you have thought about that and how a lawsuit in one place is going to, you know, bring everybody else into doing a better job.
We lost you, Spreck. You cut out there. We're wondering how everyone else is going to do a better job.
I'm sorry, so my mic's not working very well.
You just cut out for a moment.
I believe I'm wondering if at some point a lawsuit is going to be necessary.
Breck, if you can type your question into the chat, I think that would probably be better. In the meantime, I'm going to unmute Lisa. Lisa, you can go ahead and ask your question.
So we are working on doing a detailed review of several GSPs for the area we work in the northern San Joaquin Valley. And all of these GSPs, they're really focusing to balance their groundwater. They're focusing on increase in recharge and increase in surface water use. In some cases, there's some planning for additional conservation and efficiency, but none for land use changes. And I'm wondering if there are any GSPs that, I think COIA does, but I'm wondering if there are any other examples that include land use planning as part of the management actions. That would be good examples.
I can jump in, Lisa. I only can give an example just from an area where we're working with the Nature Conservancy more on the ground, and that's with Pixley and Lower Tule, and they're setting specific acreage targets for taking land out of production and doing like an intensive watershed plan with NRCS to try to navigate or to try to plan for some of those land use changes. So that's an example I can share. And then just, I want to speak more broadly about the projects and management actions because we're looking at those in the evaluation of the final plans because one of the areas of deficiency was kind of just what you mentioned, that folks were identifying hopes for recharge, but not necessarily planning for the reduction in consumptive use that needs to happen to meet sustainability in 20 years. So we're trying to assess what are their project and management actions in the first 5 years of the SGMA implementation period, and what do they do to address the overdraft in their basin, and putting together kind of a summary of that. And the next level of that being, okay, what's funded, what actually has a schedule and timeline. So that's part of the assessment that we're putting together for the final GSPs.
Thanks, Sammy. Spreck's question is more of a rhetorical question, wondering if anybody is thinking of a lawsuit with any of the recalcitrant GSAs. Could be a good precedent for everybody and an incentive to do a good job. I think that's something that Jennifer has had very long involved conversations about and would probably be a better topic to discuss offline or perhaps in your breakout group. But the short answer is yes, people are thinking about whether or not lawsuits are needed. We have time for probably one more question. Angie, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, hi. So just out of curiosity, within the GSP reviews, I know that with some of the reviews that one of our CD specialists or community development specialists had done with Community Water Center, with more kind of the focus on kind of like stakeholder engagement. I know that North Fort King's Groundwater Sustainability Agency in their December adoption hearing, they actually had included an opportunity to form an ad hoc committee for there to be like a more bigger processy of kind of just having more discussions on certain parts of the GSP that are missing that should be included within their first 5 years, 5-year implementation of their GSP. Was just wondering if there were any other GSPs that had mentioned that they would be looking into kind of adding an ad hoc committee, or if there was a GSP that actually did add an ad hoc committee for there to be opportunities for even like community residents to engage.
I think Salinas has talked about it, and we're pushing them to actually, I think they had a stakeholder engagement committee that kind of faded out, but we're pushing for it to be re-implemented. Mm-hmm. And I'm not positive about the others off the top of my head.
Okay.
Thanks, Angie. With that, I'm going to give each of our panelists 30 seconds for a closing word or comment, and then we're going to head into our next stretch break. Let's start with Sandy.
I just want to encourage folks to comment. I mean, at the end of the day, it is hard. And, you know, I think there is a way to comment without necessarily reading through everything, right? So I think there are many basic questions that I'm sure many of you have, and just raising those so that it's on the radar that there is actually constituencies out there who care about drinking water, who care about the environment, and just, posing the question, like ask the GSA, what steps have you taken to include stakeholders who will represent these sustainability values? Even that without, you don't need to dive into a technical analysis. As you're hearing from us, a lot of the NGOs are trying to fill that space. What we need more of is just the voice from the ground that's actually affirming that there are actual real stakeholders out there who care about these things from the local level. So I just, I'd hate for folks to come away from this thinking, oh, okay, the NGOs are commenting, so maybe the issue's covered, because I think it's only as powerful as if it's amplified, and there's a lot that folks can do to help us do that. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. Sammy?
Yeah, I'll echo some of what Sandy said there, which is, and just to reflect kind of one of the main lessons I was trying to share in my part. We started really in the weeds and looking at every technical detail of the plan. But I think when it comes down to it, it's really just like three main big questions. Did they engage the beneficial users that we care about? Have you been identified in the basin? And are they analyzing the impacts? And you don't have to, if you're limited in time and capacity, you don't have to necessarily confirm that all of it's completely accurate and perfect in a technical review. You can just ask that question: are they analyzing the impacts to disadvantaged communities, to groundwater dependent ecosystems? And then, is their plan setting up project and management actions, a course towards sustainability to support the users of groundwater that you care about? So I think, yeah, just echoing what Sandy said, and pulling back and seeing that forest, and making sure that you're like highlighting the big questions. If you're limited in time and capacity for a super detailed technical piece, to just really confirm, okay, we're to be recognized in this plan.
Thank you, Sammy. And Debbie?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Sammy and Sammy said. I mean, people need comment, raise the questions, raise the issues that you care about, even if you're not able to really dig in and understand the several hundred-page documents that the GSPs are. But really, we have to be pushing for better minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. The way these are set, they are going to significantly negatively impact drinking water uses and GDs and ISWs. The ecosystem and drinking water uses are just going to be the first ones to feel this. We're the ones who rely on shallow groundwater. We feel contaminants like nitrates first, and really agriculture doesn't care if nitrates are in their irrigation water. So there has to be a bigger focus on how management actions can improve or harm conditions that impact the most vulnerable of groundwater uses.
Thanks, Debbie. And I know we have a lot of questions that were captured that we haven't gotten to yet. So I encourage our three panelists, if you're willing, to respond to those questions in the chat. And also those of you who asked the questions, bring them up again in your breakout groups, which is we're going to move right into breakout groups after our next break.